Ryan barely made it to the gate before they closed the doors. His heart was still racing from the sprint through the terminal, his carry-on slung over his shoulder as he sucked in a quick breath. This wasn't supposed to be his flight. He was meant to be on a different one that left hours ago. But a last-minute emergency had changed everything. Now, exhausted and frustrated, all he wanted was to get home. With a tired sigh, he shuffled down the aisle, searching for his seat. His eyes landed on 14B, right next to a stranger. As he slid into 14B, the woman beside him barely glanced up from her book. She had dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and wore a soft, oversized sweater. Something about her presence was calming, even in the chaos of his day. Ryan exhaled and buckled his seatbelt. He wasn't the type to strike up conversations with strangers, but there was something about her that made him want to speak. The plane lurched forward, preparing for takeoff. The woman finally set her book down, stretching her fingers across the edge of the tray table. That's when he noticed how delicate they were, long, graceful fingers that looked like they belonged to someone who played an instrument or painted. "You barely made it," she said, her voice light with amusement. Ryan turned to her, surprised. "You saw that?" he asked. She nodded. "I was watching from the window." "Thought you were going to miss it." He let out a breathless chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I almost did," she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. "Rough day. You could say that," he admitted. "Last-minute flight." "Change of plans." She tilted her head, studying him. "Same here." Ryan raised a brow. "Yeah," she nodded, looking down at her hands for a moment. "I was supposed to be on a flight yesterday, but things happened." There was something in her tone, something heavy. He recognized it because he felt the same weight pressing against his ribs. "I'm Ryan," he said, offering his hand. She hesitated for half a second before slipping her hand into his. "Claire." Her touch was warm, soft. Something about it made his pulse stutter. For the first time since boarding the plane, he felt like maybe, just maybe, this flight wouldn't be as miserable as he'd imagined. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing takeoff. Claire leaned her head back against the seat, exhaling. Ryan found himself watching her, taking in the way her eyes fluttered shut for just a moment before she opened them again. "So, what made you change your plans?" he asked. She hesitated, then let out a small laugh. "It's a long story." "I've got time," he said. She looked at him, studying his face like she was trying to decide if he was someone she could trust. And then, finally, she spoke. "I was supposed to be on a flight home yesterday, after breaking off my engagement." Ryan blinked. He hadn't expected that. Claire let out a breath, shaking her head. "I know it sounds dramatic." "No," he said quickly. "I mean, yeah, but not in a bad way," she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It was a long time coming. We weren't right for each other. I think I knew it for a while, but it's hard to walk away from something when you've spent so much time trying to make it work." Ryan understood that more than he cared to admit. "I get it," he said. She arched a brow. "You do," he nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I just got out of a long relationship too." Claire's expression softened. "Was it your choice?" Ryan hesitated. "No." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she just nodded. For a moment, they sat in silence as the plane lifted into the sky. Ryan had never been the kind of guy to spill his personal life to strangers, but there was something about Claire that made it easy. He wanted to keep talking to her. "So, what now?" he asked. She turned to him. "What do you mean? What's next for you, now that you're not engaged?" Claire exhaled, tilting her head against the seat. "I don't know. I feel like I should have a plan, but I don't. I just know I couldn't stay." Ryan nodded. "Sometimes leaving is the hardest part." She looked at him, and for a second, it felt like they weren't just two strangers on a plane. It felt like they understood each other in a way that ran deeper than words. "Yeah," she whispered. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, and Claire's fingers instinctively gripped the armrest. Ryan glanced down, noticing how tightly she was holding it. "Not a fan of flying," he asked. She let out a breathless laugh. Not when it shakes like that. Without thinking, Ryan reached over and covered her hand with his. Claire sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes darting to their hands. Better, he asked, his voice quieter now. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a soft breath and nodded. Yeah. Ryan knew this was crazy. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know anything about her except that she had just walked away from something painful, just like him. But as he sat there, his hand still covering hers, he had the strangest feeling. Like maybe this last-minute flight wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe he was meant to be here. And maybe, just maybe, so was she. The hum of the plane filled the quiet space between them, but Ryan could still hear the faint hitch in Claire's breath as their hands remained pressed together. The turbulence had passed, but neither of them moved. Her fingers stayed beneath his, warm and steady now, as if she had drawn some kind of comfort from the touch. Ryan should have pulled away. They were strangers, two people who had met by chance, sharing nothing but a flight and a fleeting moment of understanding. But something about her felt familiar. Like he had known her in another life, in another time. Claire finally exhaled and let out a soft chuckle. Well, this is a first. Ryan turned his head slightly, studying the curve of her lips as they quirked into a small, amused smile. What is? Finding comfort in a stranger's hand on a plane, she said, glancing down at their entwined fingers before finally, reluctantly, pulling her hand away. Her absence left behind an odd kind of emptiness. Ryan flexed his fingers, as if trying to chase away the ghost of her warmth. Guess there's a first time for everything. Claire tilted her head, watching him now. So tell me something, Ryan, he raised a brow. Something, MHM. She shifted slightly, tucking her legs beneath her in her seat. Something real. Something you wouldn't normally tell someone you just met. Ryan blinked, surprised by the request. She wasn't the kind of woman who settled for surface-level conversations, he realized. She wanted something deeper, something meaningful. He thought for a moment, then exhaled. All right. Something real. He glanced out the window at the endless stretch of darkness beyond the wing of the plane. I hate flying. Claire's eyes widened slightly. You do? Yeah, he smirked. But not because of the turbulence. I hate it because it always means I'm leaving something behind. Something in Claire's expression shifted, her amusement fading into something softer. That's poetic, Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. I don't think anyone's ever called me that before. Well, maybe they should, she smiled, but there was something wistful in her gaze now. I get it though, the leaving part. He studied her face, the way her fingers traced absent patterns on the fabric of her sweater. What about you? He asked. She hesitated, then sighed. I guess my something real is, I don't know how to be alone. Ryan's chest tightened. He hadn't expected that. Claire looked down at her hands. I was with him for so long, I forgot what it was like to just be. Me. And now that I've walked away, I keep wondering who am I when I'm not someone's fiancé? Someone's other half. Ryan didn't know how to answer that. He only knew that the question itself struck something deep inside him. I think you'll figure it out, he said quietly. Claire met his gaze, her lips parting slightly before she smiled, small but real. I hope so. The plane dipped slightly and Claire's fingers twitched against her lap. Ryan noticed. Without thinking, he reached for her hand again, wrapping his fingers around hers. Claire sucked in a breath, but this time she didn't pull away. Instead, she tightened her grip. They sat like that for a while, hands intertwined, as if holding on to something neither of them quite understood yet. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks, and only then did Claire reluctantly pull her hand away to accept a cup of tea. Ryan asked for coffee, but as he wrapped his fingers around the warm cup, it wasn't the same as holding her hand. Claire blew gently on the surface of her tea before taking a slow sip. So where are you headed? Home, Ryan said. You, she hesitated. I don't think I know where that is anymore. Ryan's throat tightened. She was lost, just like him. Silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like they were sharing something unspoken, something fragile but important. Finally, Claire let out a breath and set her cup down. "Why did your relationship end?" Ryan stiffened for a brief moment before sighing. He didn't usually talk about it, but with Claire it felt easy. She wanted something different, he said simply. Claire frowned. Different how? Ryan stared at the rim of his coffee cup. She said she wanted more excitement. More passion. He let out a dry laugh. I guess I wasn't enough. Claire's brows knitted together, her expression turning fierce. That's ridiculous. Ryan blinked, caught off guard by her intensity. What? She shook her head. Loving someone isn't about chasing excitement, it's about choosing them every single day. And if she didn't see that? She exhaled sharply. Then she didn't deserve you. Ryan's chest ached at her words. No one had ever said something like that to him before. For a moment, he couldn't look away from her. Claire shifted under his gaze, her fingers tapping restlessly against the tray table. Sorry, I tend to get a little passionate when it comes to things like that. Ryan smiled. I don't mind. She looked up at him, and for a second, it felt like the world around them disappeared. Like they were the only two people on this plane. The only two people in the sky. Ryan didn't know what this was, but whatever it was, he wasn't ready for it to end. The plane had settled into a steady rhythm, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. It should have been just another flight, just another stretch of time spent waiting to land, but with Claire beside him, Ryan felt like he was caught in something different, something he didn't quite have a name for yet. She had gone quiet, staring out the window at the endless dark sky. Her reflection flickered in the glass, her expression unreadable. He wondered what she was thinking. If she was still caught up in the weight of leaving, in the uncertainty of starting over. Ryan had never been the kind of man to believe in fate, but sitting here with her, it felt like something had been set into motion, something neither of them had planned for. He shifted slightly, his knee brushing against hers. Claire turned toward him, her lips parting slightly at the unexpected touch. Still thinking about what's next? He asked softly. She exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head. I don't even know where to begin. He studied her for a moment. Maybe you don't have to figure it all out at once. She tilted her head, considering that. Maybe. Ryan hesitated, then asked, what would you do if you could go anywhere right now? Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question. Anywhere? Yeah. He leaned back in his seat, watching her. No obligations, no expectations, just wherever you wanted to be. She bit her lip, thoughtful. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere where I don't have to explain myself to anyone. Ryan nodded. I get that. She turned toward him slightly, her body shifting just enough that their arms almost touched. What about you? He thought about it for a moment, then said, somewhere that doesn't feel like an ending. Claire's expression softened. Yeah, she murmured. That sounds nice. The plane hit another small pocket of turbulence, and Claire stiffened, her fingers gripping the armrest again. Instinctively, Ryan reached for her hand, wrapping his fingers around hers just like before. Claire inhaled sharply, but this time, she didn't hesitate. She let him hold her hand, her grip tightening around his. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Ryan knew he shouldn't be feeling this. Whatever this was, it was too soon, too unexpected. But he couldn't ignore the way his pulse quickened when she looked at him like that, like he was something steady in the middle of uncertainty. The moment stretched between them, thick with something neither of them dared to name. Claire's fingers relaxed slightly in his grasp, but she didn't let go. She swallowed, then whispered, You're easy to talk to, you know that. Ryan smiled, his thumb brushing absently against the back of her hand. I could say the same about you. Claire glanced down at their joined hands, her lips curving into something soft. This is crazy, isn't it? Ryan exhaled a quiet laugh. Yeah. She finally pulled her hand away, and he immediately missed the warmth of her touch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire cleared her throat. We still have a few hours left. Ryan arched a brow, and, she smirked, tell me something else. Something I wouldn't expect. He thought about it, then said, I used to want to be a writer. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Really? He nodded. Yeah. When I was younger, I used to write stories. Thought maybe one day I'd turn it into something real. He let out a breathless chuckle. But life got in the way. Claire studied him for a long moment. You should still do it. Ryan glanced at her, surprised. It's been years. So, she shrugged. If it's something you still think about, maybe it's not too late. He looked at her, something tightening in his chest. You really believe that? She nodded. I do. Ryan stared at her, caught in the intensity of her gaze. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he thought. And it had everything to do with the woman sitting beside him. The plane had settled into a steady quiet, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. The world outside was nothing but darkness, stretching endlessly beyond the window, and yet, inside this space, inside this fleeting moment, Ryan felt something shift. Claire sat beside him, her head tilted slightly against the seat, her breathing even. She wasn't asleep, not fully, but she had closed her eyes as if trying to block out the weight of everything pressing down on her. Ryan knew that weight well. He had spent months carrying it, pretending it didn't exist, pretending that losing someone didn't leave a hollow space inside you. But with Claire, it felt different. Like maybe he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. She stirred slightly, her fingers curling against her lap. Her sweater had slipped off her shoulder just enough to reveal a hint of skin, and Ryan forced himself to look away, exhaling slowly. This was temporary. A moment between two strangers, bound by nothing more than circumstance. But why did it feel like more? Claire exhaled softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan, he glanced toward her. Yeah. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with exhaustion. But there was something else there too, something quieter, more vulnerable. Do you ever think about what your life would look like if just one thing had been different? Ryan frowned slightly, considering her words. Like what? She hesitated. Like if you'd stayed. If she'd stayed. He swallowed hard. He hadn't expected that. Claire must have noticed the flicker of something in his expression because she shook her head as if regretting the question. Sorry. You don't have to answer that. No, he said, his voice softer now. It's okay. He leaned his head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Yeah, I think about it sometimes. I think about what would have happened if I'd fought harder, if I'd been more, given more, if that would have been enough. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then gently she said, I don't think love is something you should have to fight for like that. Ryan turned his head toward her. No, she shook her head. No, love isn't about proving something. It's about being seen, and if she couldn't see you, she exhaled. Then maybe she was never meant to. Ryan swallowed against the tightness in his chest. And what about you? He asked. Claire blinked. What about me? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed? She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Every second. Ryan studied her face, the way her lips pressed together like she was holding something back. But you still left, she nodded, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her sweater. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't leaving, it's knowing you should. Ryan exhaled slowly. He knew that feeling all too well. For a long moment, they just sat there, breathing in the same air, caught in something fragile and uncertain. Then, Claire shifted slightly, turning toward him. Tell me something good. Ryan raised a brow. Something good. Yeah, she smiled, small but real. We've talked about everything we've lost. But tell me something that makes you happy. Ryan hesitated, caught off guard by the request. Then after a moment he said, mornings. Claire blinked. Mornings, he nodded. The quiet ones. When the world hasn't woken up yet, when it feels like you're the only person alive. Claire's lips parted slightly, something softening in her gaze. Yeah, she murmured. I like those too. Ryan let out a breathless chuckle. That's not a surprise. She tilted her head. Why not? He shrugged. You seem like the kind of person who likes the quiet. Who listens more than she speaks. Claire studied him for a long moment, and then softly she said, You see people, don't you? Ryan frowned slightly. What do you mean? She exhaled, shaking her head. I don't know, it's just, you notice things, you listen. You don't just hear what people say, you hear what they don't say too. Ryan blinked, caught off guard by her words. No one had ever said that to him before. Before he could respond, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent. Claire straightened slightly, her fingers brushing absently against her seatbelt. Reality was creeping back in. The moment the strange, unexpected intimacy of it was slipping away. Ryan glanced at her, something tightening in his chest. He didn't want this to end. But that was the thing about flights. They always landed eventually. The plane touched down with a jolt, jerking Ryan forward slightly in his seat. The soft hum of the engine slowed, and the overhead lights brightened as passengers began to stir, stretching and gathering their belongings. The moment the fleeting, delicate thing that had existed between him and Claire was slipping through his fingers like sand. Claire exhaled beside him, her fingers tracing absent circles on her sweater. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't reach for her bag or unbuckle her seatbelt. It was as if she too felt the weight of what was about to happen, the inevitable separation. Ryan had never been one to dwell on things he couldn't change. He was practical, logical. Flights ended. People parted ways. That was life. So why did this feel different? Claire turned to him, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something. He waited, his pulse kicking up in his throat. Ryan, she started, then hesitated. The way she said his name, it was soft, almost careful, as if she were trying to memorize the sound of it before it was gone. Ryan swallowed. Yeah, she hesitated again, then let out a small, breathless laugh, shaking her head. Never mind, it's nothing. It wasn't nothing. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her fingers curled slightly against her lap. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and just like that, the spell was broken. Around them, passengers stood stretching and reaching for the overhead bins. The world was moving forward, whether they were ready for it or not. Claire finally unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, grabbing her bag from beneath the seat. Ryan did the same, shouldering his carry-on. This was it. This was where they walked away. He clenched his jaw, the words pressing against his throat, but before he could say anything, Claire turned to him, her eyes searching his face. Ryan, she said again, softer this time. He looked at her, waiting. She exhaled, then smiled a small, wistful thing. I'm really glad I sat next to you. His chest tightened. Me too, he said, his voice lower than he intended. For a moment they stood there, caught in the strange in-between of goodbye. Then, someone behind them cleared their throat impatiently, and the moment shattered. Ryan turned toward the aisle, stepping aside to let others pass. Claire followed, moving with the flow of passengers down the narrow walkway. They exited the plane in silence, stepping into the too bright airport terminal. Around them, people rushed past, greeting loved ones, hurrying toward baggage claim or their next destination. Claire slowed her steps, glancing around as if trying to ground herself. Ryan shoved his hands into his pockets, his fingers curling into fists. This was it. This was where they said goodbye. Claire turned to him, offering another small smile. I guess this is where we part ways. His throat tightened. Where are you going? She hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know yet. Ryan exhaled, shifting on his feet. Claire, she looked up at him, waiting. He didn't know what he was going to say. He just knew that he wasn't ready to walk away. But before he could find the words, a voice called out. Claire! Ryan turned just as a woman hurried toward them, relief etched across her face. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with warm eyes and a kind smile. Claire's expression softened. Mom, Ryan blinked. Claire had come home. She stepped forward, letting her mother pull her into a tight embrace. I was so worried, her mother murmured, holding her close. You didn't answer my last message. I know, Claire said quietly. I'm sorry, I needed time. Her mother pulled back, studying her face. Are you okay? Claire hesitated, then glanced at Ryan. Something passed between them, something quiet but certain. Then she turned back to her mother and nodded. Yeah. I think I am. Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Claire's face. "Come on, let's get you home." Home. Ryan's chest ached. This was it. Claire turned back to him, her expression unreadable. He forced a small smile. "Take care, Claire." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, before he could react, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a quick, fierce hug. Ryan froze, caught off guard, but then instinctively he wrapped his arms around her, holding her just as tightly. She smelled like lavender and something soft, something familiar. She pulled back first, her hands lingering on his arms for half a second longer than necessary. Then she smiled. "You too, Ryan." And just like that, she turned and walked away. Ryan stood there, watching as she disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the rush of people moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Something like loss, something like possibility, something like hope. Ryan didn't see Claire again after she walked away at the airport. He told himself it was just a moment of fleeting, unexpected connection between two strangers who had crossed paths at the right time, but were never meant to stay in each other's lives. And yet days passed, then weeks, and she was still there, lingering in the back of his mind. Every time he caught the scent of lavender, every time he found himself reaching for his phone only to realize he had no way of contacting her, a strange ache settled in his chest. He had never believed in fate, but for the first time in his life, he wished he did. One evening, after another long day at work, Ryan sat on his couch, staring at the blank pages of a notebook he had bought on a whim. He hadn't written in years, but Claire's voice echoed in his mind. "You should still do it." With a deep breath, he picked up the pen and started to write. Not about work, not about the past, but about a woman on a plane, about stolen moments and quiet confessions in the dark. He didn't know what he was hoping for, maybe nothing. Maybe it was just his way of holding on to something that had already slipped through his fingers. Until one evening, when everything changed. Ryan was at a cafe, flipping through pages of his notebook when the bell above the door chimed. He barely glanced up until he heard a familiar voice. "I'll have a tea, please." "Something with lavender, if you have it." His entire body locked up. Slowly he turned, and there she was, Claire. Standing at the counter, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, looking exactly the same and yet somehow different. Softer, lighter, like she had finally exhaled. Ryan's heart slammed against his ribs. He blinked, half convinced he was imagining her, that his mind had conjured her up, because he had spent too many nights thinking about her. But then, as if sensing his gaze, Claire turned. The moment her eyes met his, time stopped. For a second, she just stared, her lips parting, shock flickering across her face. Then slowly, a smile broke across her lips. Ryan didn't think he just stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward her. "Claire," he breathed. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "Ryan." They stood there, inches apart, caught in the gravity of something neither of them had been able to let go of. Ryan swallowed hard. How are you here?" Claire smiled, tucking her hands into the sleeves of her sweater. "I came back." His chest tightened. "Back," she nodded. "I spent the last few weeks trying to figure out what I wanted, and for a while I thought it was just space. A fresh start. But the truth is, the moment I stepped off that plane, I felt like I'd left something behind." Ryan's breath hitched. "Claire," she exhaled, her gaze searching his. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again. I told myself it was just a moment, just two strangers on a plane." But she let out a breathless, almost nervous laugh. "But it wasn't, was it?" Ryan shook his head, his voice rough. "No, it wasn't." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, charged. Claire bit her lip, hesitating. "So tell me, Ryan, what happens next?" Ryan didn't answer with words. Instead, he closed the distance between them, reaching out and cupping her face in his hands. Claire inhaled sharply, her eyes flickering to his lips, her breath warm against his skin. For a split second, he hesitated, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. And then, finally, after weeks of wondering, After nights spent thinking about what could have been, Ryan kissed her. It wasn't tentative or uncertain, it was desperate, like he had been holding his breath since that night on the plane and was only now allowed to exhale. Claire melted into him with a soft sigh, her hands sliding up his chest, gripping his shirt like she was afraid he might disappear. But he wasn't going anywhere, not this time. When they finally broke apart, Claire rested her forehead against his, her breath uneven. Ryan let out a shaky laugh. "I guess this is what happens next," Claire smiled against his lips. "Yeah. I think so." And just like that, the moment that had once been fleeting, that had once been nothing more than a chance encounter, became something real, something lasting. Something that had never been a coincidence at all.